stood at the edge of the room, hands clenched around his briefcase, jaw tight. His tie was straight, his jacket crisp, but nothing could armor him against the weight of the eyes. The murmurs swirled like wind through a canyon, some curious, some scornful, and one set, sharp, cold, authoritative, belonged to Officer Brian Harlow. Harlow's stare found him before Elijah even reached the front. "You don't belong here," the officer spat, stepping closer, his hand hovering near the holster like it might decide the next second. The words were simple, but they carried a century of assumptions, 1,000 invisible rules written in fear and prejudice. Elijah's pulse hammered, every nerve screaming for composure. He met Harlow's gaze evenly, but before a word could leave his lips, the officer's palm struck his cheek. A sharp, red sting, echoing in the hushed room. Gasps, a few suppressed laughs, a judge clearing their throat. Elijah touched his face, numb disbelief spreading through him. "You'll learn your place," Harlow sneered, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. Elijah's eyes darted toward the bench. His father, the man in the black robe, gavel in hand, already standing, face frozen in recognition, shock splitting a composed exterior. The slap, the humiliation, the officer's assumption, they were about to unravel everything. A single, piercing moment of silence hung over the courtroom, and then the gavel lifted. Nothing moved. And then a whisper of realization passed through Elijah's father's eyes, a promise of reckoning. The courtroom held its breath. The next second would define them all. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and tension, a scent Elijah Moore had learned to associate with both order and intimidation. He adjusted his tie, straightened his jacket, and stepped past the heavy oak doors, briefcase in hand. Every footstep echoed, sharp against the marble floors, a staccato drum of anticipation. Murmurs swirled around him. Curious eyes whispered judgment, and one, cold, calculating, authoritative, that sent a shiver down his spine. Officer Brian Harlow. Harlow stood at the edge of the aisle, shoulders squared, eyes narrowing as Elijah passed. "You don't belong here," he said, voice low but clipped, carrying a weight Elijah had felt countless times in less formal spaces. The words were simple, but the implication was centuries deep. This man assumed dominion over his presence. Elijah's jaw tightened. He held his head high, slow, deliberate breaths grounding him. "I am here to testify," he said, voice even. Harlow's smirk was quick, predatory. "Testify? You think you'll—" The officer reached out, palm snapping across Elijah's cheek in a sharp, red sting. The slap rang through the room, muffled gasps rising like wind through a canyon of chairs. Time fractured. Elijah touched his face, numb, disbelief blooming into a hot, silent rage. "You'll learn your place," Harlow said. The courtroom shifted. A judge cleared his throat. Some witnesses looked away, unwilling to meet the audacity. Others whispered, stunned. Elijah's mind raced, but his body remained poised, every nerve coiled in silent defiance. Then Elijah's gaze lifted to the bench. His father, the man in the black robe, presiding with gavel in hand, already standing, face frozen in recognition. The shock split the composed exterior, revealing the same disbelief Elijah felt internally. Elijah's pulse hammered. It was ringing with the slap's echo. The room's tension became almost tactile, a charged electric current connecting every witness, every bystander, every silent observer to the moment's injustice. Harlow's arrogance had miscalculated the stakes, and the courtroom seemed to sense it. He remembered every injustice he had endured before, every microaggression, every assumed inferiority, every dismissive glance. But this public, humiliating slap crystallized a systemic force against him. His father's eyes were on him, a silent question of restraint and reaction, of public decorum versus paternal instinct. The murmurs thickened, swelling into an almost physical pressure. Elijah inhaled slowly, counting, grounding himself. He could feel the weight of history, the continuum of assumed power and subtle, institutionalized racial bias pressing against him. Harlow's eyes flicked to the bench, realization dawning too late. The man in the robe, the judge, the authority, was Elijah's father. Recognition split Harlow's smirk. The cocky arrogance faltered. The room seemed to inhale collectively. A single moment stretched. The slap had landed, but the ramifications hovered above like a storm cloud. The gavel lifted, a metallic whisper of potential justice. All eyes followed it, and all futures balanced on the edge of that suspended second. Elijah's father's gaze locked with his own, a silent communication, endurance, patience, and calculated action. The room was silent except for the faint scraping of a chair, the barely audible rustle of papers. The tension was cinematic, palpable, ready to explode. Elijah touched his cheek again, feeling the sting, the proof of humiliation. And yet beneath it, a spark of clarity. This was a moment the system would either bend or break. Harlow had assumed unchecked power. He had misjudged both the man in front of him and the quiet force of a family legacy intertwined with justice. Every heartbeat, every shallow breath, carried the weight of what would come next. The courtroom waited. Elijah stepped into the hallway, each footfall reverberating against the cold tile. His hand pressed lightly to his cheek, still tingling from the slap, heat radiating across his skin. The polished corridor felt narrower than usual, as if the walls themselves were pressing in, observing, judging. Whispers trailed behind him like shadows, some sympathetic, some hesitant, most silent. "Are you okay?" a young clerk asked, voice low, eyes darting toward the courtroom. Elijah shook his head subtly, not trusting word to carry the weight of what had just occurred. He forced his composure, straightened his shoulders, and continued toward the elevator. From the far end, Harlow leaned against the wall, smirk lingering. "You might wonder what's your tone next time," he called, voice casual, but loaded with menace. A few passers-by shifted uneasily, avoiding direct confrontation. Elijah's pulse quickened. The room seemed smaller, the air thick. Elijah slowed, letting the elevator doors close with deliberate patience. He could hear Harlow chuckling softly to a colleague, the sound sharp and cruel against the hum of fluorescent lights. It wasn't just a slap. It was a declaration, a reminder of unspoken rules, invisible yet rigid. He leaned against a cool metal wall, taking a slow breath. This was a first ripple, the immediate aftermath, but the tide was already building. People watched, but fear kept them still. Even colleagues, those he'd known for years, offered only tentative words. "I saw what happened. That was unexpected. Are you going to?" Leaving the question incomplete. Elijah's father appeared in the hallway moments later, robed slightly askew, face pale but composed. He placed a hand briefly on Elijah's shoulder, firm and grounding. "We handle this carefully," he said, tone clipped. His eyes, however, flickered toward Harlow, burning with restrained anger. The unspoken message was clear. The officer had crossed a line, and there would be consequences, but they would come in measured form. Elijah nodded, swallowing a dry laugh of disbelief that threatened to escape. He couldn't yet process the humiliation. The shock of authority turned violent. Every fiber of his body screamed for confrontation, for immediate justice, but decorum, experience, and caution anchored him. A few feet away, witnesses lingered, some frozen, some murmuring. Their faces told the same story: curiosity, fear, and disbelief. The hallway was a mirror of systemic inertia, the moment everyone had seen, yet few had dared intervene. Even in public spaces designed to uphold law and fairness, power imbalance persisted, subtle and blunt. Harlow stepped forward, smirk fading as he noticed the judge in the hallway. He straightened quickly, posture defensive. I didn't mean," he began, but the words faltered, incomplete. Recognition had stripped his bravado, leaving only the thin mass of uncertainty. Elijah met Harlow's gaze steadily, a cold calm settling over him. "This ends properly," he said, voice low, deliberate. Harlow's jaw tightened, the silence between them thick with the unspoken acknowledgement that the public, the institution, and Elijah himself would no longer tolerate unchecked aggression. The elevator dinged open, the doors sliding aside like a release. Elijah stepped in first, father close behind, leaving Harlow leaning in the hallway, facing not just a physical corridor, but the narrowing path of his authority. The ride downward was quiet except for the mechanical hum. Elijah's father remained beside him, present, steady, watchful, signaling both protection and an understanding of the system's limitations. The hallway behind them seemed to shrink further into the background, the echoes of the slap lingering in every reflective surface, in every whispered remark. By the time they reached the lobby, Elijah had shifted his weight, shoulders squared, mind already cataloging the path forward. This was the aftermath. Humiliation experienced, public attention flickering, power dynamics clarified. But it was only the beginning. The first step toward justice had been taken. The real fight, the legal maneuvering, the exposure, the accountability, was waiting outside the courthouse doors. And outside, Harlow's presence, once imposing, now trembled under the weight of recognition and consequence. Elijah sat across from his attorney, papers spread across a sleek oak table, the air heavy with a faint scent of ink and leather. The courtroom slap had left a sting not only on his cheek, but deep in his pride. Every detail mattered now: witnesses, procedural missteps, officer conduct. He had prepared for civil hearings, but not this, a deliberate act of aggression within the walls of justice itself. First, his lawyer began, voice clipped, "We document everything. Witness statements, medical notes if necessary, and the courtroom video. This isn't just about a slap, it's about authority abuse, systemic bias exposed." Elijah nodded, recalling every subtle glance, every microaggression, the way Harlow had blocked his path, the smirk before the strike. "I want this on record," he said, "publicly and legally. He can't get away with assuming dominance because of uniform and skin color." His father's presence loomed over him, even if physically absent from the meeting. He had advised caution earlier, a quiet voice reminding Elijah that family ties and institutional boundaries complicated every move. Yet, the sting on his cheek screamed louder than diplomacy. He couldn't let that moment fade into silent acceptance. Timing matters, the lawyer continued, tapping a pen against the paper. Internal affairs will investigate, but Harlow's behavior might be excused as misjudgment unless we apply pressure. And the court's hierarchy, it's delicate. Your father can support you, but only subtly. Publicly, we have to build a watertight case. Elijah inhaled, processing. Procedural nuances, coded language, institutional inertia, everything that seemed invisible now had to be weaponized. "I've dealt with assumptions all my life," he said, voice low, deliberate. "But this crossed a line." They drafted complaints, prepared witness lists, and outlined possible outcomes. Dialogue dominated the room. Strategy, warnings, contingency plans. Every phrase mattered. Misstep could allow Harlow to deflect, the institution to protect its own. Outside the office window, the city hummed, oblivious to the small but significant legal battle unfolding inside. In the hallway, Elijah recalled the stifled gasps, the uncertain murmurs of colleagues. The system often favored authority, silently condoning microaggressions until escalation made it impossible to ignore. "Remember," his lawyer said, "we're not just offending you. We're exposing patterns. Harlow isn't just one man acting alone. He represents systemic bias. If we prove this, it resonates beyond your case." Elijah's father later joined them briefly, careful not to overstep professional boundaries. He conveyed unspoken support, the kind only a parent and experienced jurist could offer: a glance, a tightening of lips, a nod that promised both pride and restraint. It was enough. Harlow's arrogance was consistent, yet predictable. Every interaction, every presumption of superiority had been catalogued by Elijah. Now, those moments would serve as evidence of habitual misconduct, demonstrating a collision of personal prejudice and institutional power. The attorney highlighted subtleties, previous complaints against officers, records of bias, patterns of behavior that suggested more than isolated misconduct. Elijah listened, internalizing every procedural detail. He visualized each confrontation, each courtroom appearance, the sequence of dialogue and witnesses building toward accountability. "They'll try to gaslight you," the lawyer warned. "They'll suggest exaggeration, misinterpretation. You remain calm, concise, factual. Let the evidence speak louder than your outrage." Elijah nodded, appreciating the careful calibration. Emotional truth mattered, but strategy required discipline. Dialogue with witnesses would capture fear, hesitation, and the subtle ways microaggressions escalated to violence. Narration would be minimal, but each moment recorded had to convey moral stakes. Late afternoon sun filtered through the office blinds, casting long shadows across the table. Elijah imagined the courtroom, the procedural steps, the gavel, the murmurs. The system was flawed, layered with deference to authority and hidden biases, yet each calculated move brought him closer to challenging that power. The first formal complaint was filed that evening. Elijah's signature was steady, deliberate. Every document, every statement, every witness coordination reinforced a simple truth. Authority could not act without consequence, and personal resilience paired with legal rigor could bend the scales, even against entrenched systemic bias. Before leaving, Elijah paused in the lobby, imagining Harlow pacing somewhere, unaware that the tide had shifted. The officer's confidence was still intact, but cracks were forming. One misstep, one procedural exposure, and the facade of dominance would fracture. Elijah's father remained nearby, eyes quiet but observant, the duality of parent and jurist guiding the next steps. Elijah's mind catalogued the next moves, evidence verification, formal hearings, press strategy, witness alignment. Each step was methodical, tactical. The slap had ignited a chain of legal and social consequences, and Elijah would navigate every channel with precision. Dialogue and documentation became instruments of accountability, shaping a path toward justice without sacrificing dignity or composure. By nightfall, the framework for confrontation was solidified. The officer's miscalculation was no longer just a personal affront. It was a systemic challenge. And Elijah, with every strategic move, was prepared to expose not only Harlow's prejudice but the structural failures that enabled it. The faint vibration of a phone on the conference table drew Elijah's attention. One of the courthouse interns, nervous and fidgeting, had captured the slap on a discreetly held phone. I just recorded it," the intern whispered. "I thought people should see it." Elijah took a deep breath, understanding the risk and the opportunity. The video could expose the truth or distort it depending on the context. Within hours, the clip was circulating online. Social media lit up with reactions, outrage, support, condemnation, and speculation. Comments ranged from visceral anger to dismissive jokes. Every news share amplified the public weight of the moment. The courthouse walls that once confined the incident now expanded into a virtual arena, and Elijah found himself in the center. Elijah's father called him in the early evening, his voice tight but controlled. "I've seen it. The footage is undeniable. But be careful how you respond publicly. The media twists quickly." Elijah nodded, acutely aware of the delicate balance between exposing injustice and maintaining dignity. "I want the truth known," he said. "Everything else follows from that." Harlow, on the other hand, remained reckless. Within the courthouse, he attempted to downplay the incident to colleagues, claiming misunderstanding or provocation. Social media attention undermined him instantly. Clips were analyzed frame by frame, commentators highlighting both his aggression and the systemic implications of authority unchecked. Public discourse became a battlefield, and Elijah's personal humiliation transformed into a collective rallying point. Calls and messages flooded in, support from friends, colleagues, and strangers who had witnessed similar biases. Some offered advice, others warned of retaliation. Elijah absorbed it all, balancing emotional fatigue with strategic clarity. The viral exposure heightened pressure on internal affairs and courthouse administration to act. At home that evening, Elijah sat with his father, reviewing public responses, internal statements, and preliminary legal filings. Dialogue was precise, matter-of-fact. "We control our narrative," his father said. "Let evidence lead, not emotion. Every misstep can be weaponized against us." Elijah listened, processing each nuance. The balance of exposure and legal restraint became a living strategy. Despite the social storm, Elijah remained composed. He understood the psychological terrain. Public shaming of authority could catalyze change, but it could also backfire, intensifying personal attacks or institutional defensiveness. Every comment, tweet, and video replay was a microcosm of societal bias, reflecting both latent support and entrenched prejudice. By nightfall, the courthouse and social networks alike were alight with debate. The slap had moved from private humiliation to public reckoning. Harlow's misjudgment was no longer just an internal problem. It had become a societal critique. Elijah realized that the battle was expanding beyond personal or familial stakes. This was systemic, exposing both individual prejudice and institutional inertia. He reviewed the comments one last time, noting patterns. Most people condemned the action, some debated procedural propriety, and a few attempted to diminish the significance. Dialogue from online interactions informed his next steps, measured statements, formal complaints, and preparation for confrontation with both authority and public perception. The viral leak cemented the stakes. Elijah understood that perception now mattered as much as evidence. Harlow's facade of control was crumbling under scrutiny, and the courthouse hierarchy could no longer ignore the implications. The momentum was shifting. The day ended with a quiet resolve. Elijah, sitting beside his father, mapped the coming weeks: legal preparation, witness coordination, media management, and public statements. The slap had ignited a chain reaction that would test every measure of patience, resilience, and strategy. Harlow's power was exposed. Elijah's response would define the trajectory of accountability and justice. Elijah convened with his legal team early the next morning. The conference room hummed with a low murmur of voices, pens scratching, papers shuffling. Every detail of the courtroom incident had been catalogued: witness accounts, surveillance footage, microaggressions, Harlow's past conduct. Strategy dominated the dialogue, each word deliberate, tactical. "We build this like a chessboard," his lead attorney said. "Every move calculated. Harlow is predictable, arrogant, impulsive. We use his patterns against him." Elijah nodded, leaning forward. "We need leverage beyond the slap. Witnesses, internal complaints, procedural violations. He thrives on intimidation. Remove that and is exposed." Discussion turned to the bystander who recorded the video, office clerks who observed but hesitated, and courtroom staff who might testify. Dialogue with the legal team focused on phrasing, emotional tone, and documentation. Every word in a statement could either reinforce or weaken the case. His father entered briefly, robe still draped, his presence quiet but commanding. He did not speak at length, but his gaze conveyed understanding. Authority and family intertwined, procedural caution tempered by paternal concern. Elijah felt steadiness in that glance, a silent endorsement of resilience paired with prudence. Later, Elijah rehearsed interactions with witnesses, coaching them to describe not only the slap but Harlow's demeanor before and after, the microaggressions, and the subtle intimidation that escalated to violence. Dialogue exercises focus on clarity, emotional authenticity, and precision. He emphasized narrative control, letting the truth emerge unvarnished but unmistakable. Harlow's predictable arrogance became the team's primary tool. Elijah reviewed prior incidents, documented patterns, and cross-referenced them with institutional procedures. Each procedural misstep was a lever, each witness a prism refracting systemic bias. "Remember," his attorney said, "this is not about revenge. It's accountability. Emotional satisfaction is secondary. Public exposure without strategy can backfire. Discipline, patience, precision, that is your weapon." Elijah internalized every word. Strategy demanded detachment from immediate anger, transforming humiliation into methodical action. His father's quiet presence reinforced the principle: power misuse could be countered by intelligence, patience, and systematic resistance. Even as social media amplified the video, Elijah curated responses meticulously. Brief, factual statements released to select journalists emphasized injustice without sensationalism. Dialogue with the press was controlled, each sentence designed to anchor narrative, assert moral authority, and mitigate personal attack. Tension remained high. The courthouse's bureaucratic inertia surfaced in small, coded gestures, delayed responses, vague assurances, procedural deferrals. Dialogue with clerks and staff revealed both sympathy and fear. Microaggressions persisted, subtle yet telling, remarks about overreaction, hushed comment implying provocation, all attempt to normalize aggression and minimize accountability. Elijah maintained composure. He anticipated retaliation from Harlow, provocative statements, attempts to intimidate witnesses, subtle harassment. Dialogue rehearsals, legal briefings, and witness coordination became defensive armor. Every encounter with the officer had to be predictable, measured, and documented. By afternoon, the plan crystallized: internal complaint, formal legal filing, strategic media exposure, and witness preparation. Elijah and his team created multiple contingency pathways, anticipating obstacles at both institutional and social levels. Every decision balanced risk with potential for meaningful accountability. Elijah's father joined him briefly for reflection. Dialogue was minimal, focused on practicalities. "Patience," he said. "Restraint is power. Let the system falter under its own bias." His words were directive, a reminder that emotional reaction without strategy could compromise the pursuit of justice. Evening came, but Elijah remained in the office, reviewing every angle. The slap had ignited more than personal grievance. It was now a test of systemic accountability. Every witness, statement, and procedural tactic became a building block, each designed to constrain Hollow's authority and expose the institutional tolerance of bias. In the quiet hours, Elijah reflected on the duality of his role: son and advocate, victim and strategist, dialogue with allies, legal advisors, and his father was not casual. It was tactical, each exchange serving the overarching goal of dismantling a system that allowed Hollow's unchecked aggression. By nightfall, the framework was solid. Elijah's posture was steady, mind alert, and purpose clear. Every microaggression, every procedural injustice, every societal expectation became an instrument of resistance. Hollow's dominance was fragile, dependent on intimidation and assumption. Elijah would expose it, methodically, without surrendering dignity or composure. The first wave of formal legal maneuvers was set to launch the following morning. Strategic resistance had begun. The courtroom incident, once a moment of humiliation, had become the catalyst for deliberate, calculated, and morally grounded accountability. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and anticipation. Elijah stepped in, suit crisp, briefcase in hand, carrying the weight of days spent preparing every detail. The gavel's echo seemed louder than usual, resonating with tension and unresolved grievance. Hollow was already present, standing rigidly near the bench, hands folded, eyes scanning the room for advantage. "Mr. Moore," the judge began, voice steady but aware, "we are here to review a complaint filed against Officer Hollow regarding conduct on the record." Elijah noted the careful neutrality, the balance of authority and paternal concern visible in the judge's eyes. Hollow smirked initially, leaning back, confidence radiating. "I don't see what the problem is," he said. His tone implied dismissal, superiority, the same arrogance that had led to the slap. The courtroom felt suffocating, each whisper from spectators amplifying the stakes. Elijah opened his briefcase, pulling out evidence meticulously documented: witness statements, video footage, and prior records of Hollow's behavior. His voice was calm, measured, each sentence deliberate. "On date, Officer Hollow physically struck me in the courtroom, unprovoked, in front of staff, witnesses, and the presiding judge." He paused, letting the words resonate. This act was an abuse of authority, racially biased, and a violation of protocol. Dialogue dominated the room. Witnesses were called one by one, each providing nuanced accounts of Hollow's aggression and microaggressions leading up to the incident. Colleagues described hushed warnings, subtle intimidation, and the officer's repeated assumption of dominance over individuals he deemed out of place. Each statement built a layered portrait of misconduct. Hollow's attempts to interrupt were frequent. "He provoked me," he began, only to be coattailed by firm procedural reminders. Each interruption revealed not authority, but insecurity, a crack in the facade of control he had relied on. Elijah's father observed quietly, his gavel at hand but unused. His presence lent both weight and subtle protection. Every glance, every gesture reinforced a silent directive: composure, patience, and moral authority. The courtroom became a chessboard of dialogue, procedural correctness, and psychological pressure. Elijah's testimony emphasized not just the slap, but the micro-level racial bias inherent in Hollow's assumptions. "He assumed my presence was inappropriate," Elijah said. "He assumed my tone indicated disrespect." These assumptions escalated to physical aggression. This is not isolated, it's systemic. Hollow shifted uncomfortably, the veneer of confidence cracking. Each witness corroborated Elijah's narrative, highlighting patterns of intimidation and disregard for protocol. The officer's responses, defensive and inconsistent, contrasted sharply with the calm precision of Elijah's account. The gavel remained poised, a silent threat of consequence. Dialogue between the judge, attorneys, and witnesses revealed the institutional machinery in motion: internal affairs protocols, procedural reviews, and accountability channels. The courtroom itself became a microcosm of systemic bias and its potential unraveling. Elijah maintained composure, aware of the emotional toll but refusing to allow it to dictate his demeanor. His father's presence reminded him of both lineage and principle. Authority must be held accountable, and justice required methodical clarity. By the time closing statements were delivered, Harlow's bravado was diminished. The evidence, the carefully curated witness testimony, and Elijah's measured dialogue had created a tapestry impossible to ignore. The officer's arrogance was laid bare, every presumption of unchecked dominance exposed and undermined. As the judge prepared to deliberate, the courtroom held a tangible silence. The confrontation had not been about immediate revenge. It had been about dismantling authority built on bias and intimidation. Elijah's strategy, rooted in patience, preparation, and resilience, had transformed humiliation into accountability. Even Harlow seemed to sense the shift. His posture was rigid, eyes avoiding direct contact. A man realizing that power maintained through fear was now contingent upon exposure, scrutiny, and procedural integrity. Elijah's pulse remained steady. He understood that victory was not guaranteed, but the balance had shifted. Dialogue, documentation, and strategic resistance had exposed the fragility of unchecked authority. The courtroom's energy reflected this: anticipation, tension, and the subtle satisfaction of justice poised to act. The gavel lifted. Silence thickened. Hearts paused, the weight of moral consequence pressing upon every observer. Elijah's confrontation had achieved its immediate purpose. The system could no longer ignore the abuse of power, and the officer who had assumed dominance based on bias was now facing the undeniable force of truth, strategy, and accountability. By morning, the viral courtroom video had exploded across social media platforms. News outlets replayed the slap repeatedly, commentary dissecting the officer's behavior and institutional implications. Elijah watched the coverage with a measured eye, noting patterns in public reaction: outrage, solidarity, skepticism, and, in small pockets, defensive rationalizations of Harlow's actions. "People are paying attention now," his lawyer said, pointing to live analytics and social sentiment graphs. "This shifts everything. Institutional response is inevitable." Elijah's father joined him briefly in his office, robe folded over one arm. "The public eye changes the calculus," he said, voice low. "We have leverage, but we cannot overextend. Precision remains paramount." Elijah nodded. Every step was deliberate. Statements, interviews, and internal communications crafted to emphasize evidence over emotion. Harlow, meanwhile, struggled under the glare. Colleagues whispered, superiors questioned, and internal affairs initiated formal inquiries. His confident posture faltered. Arrogance gave way to defensive tension. Attempts to downplay or rationalize the incident were met with public scrutiny amplified by social media. Interviews with witnesses and minor staff corroborated Elijah's account. Dialogue highlighted systemic bias, the assumption of incompetence based on race, subtle intimidation, and the escalation from microaggression to physical violence. Each statement reinforced a narrative of abuse of authority. The public conversation became a battleground. Online forums debated procedural propriety, racial bias, and institutional accountability. Every repost, comment, and media clip added pressure on the courthouse hierarchy to act decisively. Elijah and his father monitored the discourse, calibrating responses to maintain moral authority and procedural correctness. Harlow attempted a statement to a local outlet. His words were defensive, stilted, and ultimately undermined by juxtaposition with evidence and eyewitness testimony. The contrast was stark: calm, factual, measured dialogue from Elijah versus bluster, and excuses from the officer. The public quickly recognized the discrepancy. Institutional consequences began to accumulate. Harlow faced reassignment, suspension pending review, and public censure. His social credibility eroded. Colleagues hesitated to defend him, and authority previously assumed without challenge was now scrutinized. Dialogue in internal meetings reflected unease, recognition of error, and the dawning realization of vulnerability. Elijah observed, silent but deliberate, aware of the psychological and social dimensions of accountability. The courtroom incident had expanded into a societal critique, revealing both systemic bias and the mechanisms of accountability when public attention and evidence intersect. Even as Harlow's professional standing faltered, Elijah's father reinforced the importance of restraint and dignity. Vindication is measured, not performative, he reminded. Let the consequences speak. Your composure defines the difference between justice and spectacle. Elijah internalized the advice, balancing personal satisfaction with strategic responsibility. By the end of the week, public opinion had largely consolidated. Commentary emphasized systemic issues rather than isolated misconduct, with Harlow portrayed as emblematic of broader institutional failures. Dialogue between legal teams, media representatives, and courthouse officials became increasingly structured, reflecting a shift from casual defense to formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Elijah recognized the cost of public reckoning, personal fatigue, exposure, and the emotional toll of reliving humiliation were real. Yet, the momentum toward accountability validated the calculated patience, evidence-based strategy, and moral clarity that had guided his response. As the courthouse prepared formal statements, Harlow's isolation was evident. Former allies withdrew, his prior authority undermined by documented misconduct and public scrutiny. Elijah's calculated exposure of systemic bias had achieved tangible consequences, demonstrating that carefully executed resistance could enforce accountability even against entrenched power. By evening, Elijah reflected with his father on the cumulative effect, public validation of wrongdoing, institutional action, and the slow but inevitable erosion of Harlow's power. The chapter closed with a cinematic tension, mirroring the hook. Authority misuse had been exposed, accountability enforced, and social equilibrium tested. Elijah returned home, removing his jacket and loosening his tie. The day's events weighed on him, heavy with tension and residual adrenaline. In the quiet at his apartment, he reflected on the recent upheaval, the slap, the viral video, the confrontation, and the growing social and legal consequences for Harlow. Every detail, every moment of public scrutiny, had exacted a cost. His father arrived shortly after, robe neatly folded over one arm. There were no formalities, no speeches, only presence. They sat together in the living room, the silence comfortable yet charged with unspoken acknowledgement. "It's over, at least publicly," his father said, voice low, deliberate. "But don't mistake resolution for relief. The work, the vigilance, that continues." Elijah nodded, understanding. Public vindication was not emotional closure. The humiliation lingered, etched into memory and psyche. Dialogue between father and son focused on reflection rather than strategy, lessons learned, the persistence of systemic injustice, and the delicate balance between accountability and restraint. They discussed family, legacy, and the weight of authority wielded responsibly. "You've held yourself with dignity," his father said. "That matters more than temporary satisfaction." Elijah appreciated the measured tone. Authority could enforce consequences, but emotional integrity required restraint. The conversation shifted to the social implications. Elijah reflected on the viral video, media coverage, and public reaction. He realized the incident had catalyzed discussions about racial bias, microaggressions, and systemic accountability. Dialogue highlighted responsibility, not just personal vindication, but advocacy for broader understanding and change. Even in private, the psychological cost remained. Elijah admitted, in quiet phrases, the lingering sting of humiliation, the fatigue of public exposure, and the tension of constant vigilance. His father listened, offering acknowledgement rather than solutions, the presence of experience guidance grounding Elijah's reflection. They spoke of reconciliation, trust, and resilience. Dialogue emphasized that healing was neither linear nor complete. Emotional scars persisted, but they were tempered by the knowledge of having acted decisively with intelligence and strategy to confront abuse of authority and racial bias. Later, Elijah reviewed his notes, the documented statements, and the legal progress. The framework for accountability remained intact. Harlow's professional position had been diminished, public scrutiny was sustained, and institutional awareness had been reinforced. Yet, the emotional narrative, the humiliation, fear, and stress was as alone to process. In small gestures, father and son reaffirmed familial bonds. A shared cup of coffee, a nod of acknowledgement, the quiet understanding of endurance and perseverance. Dialogue was sparse but meaningful, punctuated by reflection and subtle humor, a reminder that life persisted beyond the courtroom battles. The evening faded into night. Elijah prepared for rest, understanding that healing would be gradual. Public vindication had been achieved, systemic consequences enforced, and personal dignity preserved. Yet, the emotional landscape remained complex, marked by trauma, resilience, and the ever-present awareness of societal bias. The chapter closed with a quiet cinematic moment. Father and son seated side by side, the city lights casting long shadows through the window. The battle was won, but the work of reflection, healing, and vigilance continued. It was a moment of equilibrium, fragile yet meaningful, signaling both recovery and enduring awareness. The courthouse corridors felt different now, charged with quiet acknowledgement of accountability. Harlow moved through them with measured steps, aware that every glance, every whisper, signaled his diminishing authority. The viral video, combined with the meticulously documented complaints, had shifted the balance of power. Internal Affairs had convened a formal hearing. The dialogue was controlled, procedural, and precise. Harlow attempted to defend himself, citing misunderstandings and claiming provocation. Witnesses, prepared and consistent, countered every assertion with factual, unemotional accounts. Each exchange underscored his arrogance, now undermined by a cascade of evidence. Elijah observed silently from the back of the hearing room, aware of the weight of each statement, the subtle power of procedural integrity. He had transformed humiliation into methodical exposure, leveraging every detail to dismantle the officer's assumed dominance. Witnesses detailed the sequence, microaggressions leading to intimidation, intimidation escalating to violence, and the institutional inertia that allowed it to persist. Dialogue revealed not just Harlow's personal bias, but the systemic patterns that empowered such behavior. Colleagues, previously hesitant, testified about prior incidents, the coded language, and the small, daily abuses that often went unchecked. Every account reinforced the narrative. Harlow's behavior was part of a broader, institutionalized dynamic. The contrast between factual reporting and Harlow's faltering denials became increasingly stark. The judge, Elijah's father, maintained formal neutrality, yet his presence conveyed subtle authority. His procedural corrections and measured inquiries ensured fairness while underscoring Harlow's missteps. Dialogue was clipped, precise, and impactful, balancing judicial responsibility with moral weight. By mid-afternoon, the verdict was evident even before formal announcement. Harlow faced disciplinary action, reassignment, suspension pending further review, and public censure. The cascading effect of institutional, legal, and social scrutiny had dismantled the facade of unchecked authority. Dialogue among officials reflected cautious acknowledgement of systemic accountability finally enforced. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered. Elijah maintained composure, brief statements emphasizing systemic reform rather than personal satisfaction. Dialogue reinforced a moral core. Accountability was not revenge, but consequence, rooted in evidence and ethical principle. Harlow, isolated and diminished, attempted to speak to journalists, but every word was juxtaposed against corroborated testimony. The disparity between arrogance and accountability was public, undeniable, and irreversible. Social media commentary mirrored this, reinforcing the collapse of his assumed power. Elijah's father joined him briefly afterward. "Poetic justice," he said quietly, "is not spectacle. It is consequence aligned with principle." Elijah nodded, internalizing the lesson. Exposing abuse required patience, precision, and unwavering adherence to ethical strategy. The chapter concluded with a cinematic visual, Harlow leaving the courthouse, posture defeated, the weight of systemic exposure pressing down. Elijah stood nearby, calm, composed, embodying both resilience and measured authority. The narrative arc of humiliation, resistance, confrontation, and accountability reached its apex, demonstrating the effective intersection of personal integrity and institutional oversight. Weeks later, Elijah sat in his office, the city skyline framed through the window. The legal and public battles had concluded, but the experience lingered, etched in memory, in muscle memory, in the subtle tension of everyday vigilance. The slap, once a moment of acute humiliation, now functioned as a lens through which systemic bias, personal resilience, and strategic resistance could be understood. His father entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've navigated this well," he said, voice measured, eyes scanning the documents on Elijah's desk. Not everyone would maintain composure, strategy, and moral clarity simultaneously. Elijah nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without seeking affirmation. The dialogue that followed was deliberate, reflective rather than procedural. They discussed patterns observed, microaggressions, institutional deference to authority, the subtle cues of bias embedded in everyday interactions. Elijah articulated insights gained. Resilience is paired with precision, accountability requires documentation, and systemic bias can be challenged without sacrificing integrity. Elijah reflected on the cost. Emotional strain, the fatigue of public scrutiny, and the enduring sting of humiliation remain present. Yet, these were tempered by the knowledge that measured action, grounded in evidence and ethical strategy, could dismantle assumptions of power based on prejudice. Dialogue with allies, legal advisors, and family had shaped not only outcome but perspective. The public response had been instructive. Conversations about racial bias, authority, and accountability had expanded beyond the incident itself. Elijah recognized the duality of exposure, personal vindication, and societal reflection. Each interaction, witnesses, media, colleagues, had been an opportunity to reinforce patterns of accountability and demonstrate moral clarity. He reviewed Harlow's professional consequences and the broader institutional response. Reassignment, suspension, and public censure represented tangible accountability. Dialogue among courthouse officials, internal affairs, and media outlets reflected an emergent awareness of systemic bias and a tentative commitment to reform. Elijah cataloged these outcomes, aware that change was incremental, never absolute. Elijah's father spoke of legacy, not in terms of personal achievement, but in the reinforcement of principle. Authority misuse cannot endure scrutiny indefinitely. Vigilance, strategy, and integrity ensure accountability persists beyond individual incidents. Elijah absorbed the words, internalizing the dual mandate of personal and societal responsibility. Reflection extended to personal growth. Elijah recognized the interplay of emotion and strategy, the importance of dialogue over confrontation, and the value of procedural rigor in translating moral outrage into effective change. His own composure, tested repeatedly, had become both shield and instrument, allowing him to navigate complex institutional and social terrain. Even in quiet moments, Elijah acknowledged the psychological residue. Trauma, vigilance, and awareness persisted, a reminder that justice, while achieved, carries a cost. Yet the narrative of resistance, exposure, and accountability had shifted not only Harlow's authority, but also Elijah's understanding of power, bias, and resilience. The chapter closed with a cinematic moment, Elijah standing at his office window, the city alive below, reflecting on the journey from humiliation to strategic triumph. The sun dipped, casting long shadows across the room, symbolizing both the lingering impact of injustice and the enduring clarity of resolved purpose. Dialogue within his own mind articulated lessons learned, principles reinforced, and a commitment to continued vigilance against systemic bias. The story ended not with triumphal celebration, but with reflective equilibrium, justice enacted, resilience preserved, and awareness sharpened, a personal and societal reckoning captured in measured, ethical action. Months later, the courthouse had returned to routine, yet the memory of the incident lingered like a faint but persistent echo. Elijah walked through the corridors with quiet confidence, each step measured, aware of the subtle shifts in atmosphere. Colleagues no longer whispered in hushed tones of doubt or fear. Instead, there was respect, acknowledgement of his resilience, and recognition of the principles he had upheld. Harlow's presence was diminished. Reassigned to administrative duties, isolated from courtroom interactions, he navigated his reduced authority with visible discomfort. The arrogance that once defined him had been replaced by cautious vigilance, his every action now subject to scrutiny and memory of past missteps. Dialogue with subordinates revealed hesitation where once there had been command. The social dynamics irrevocably altered. Elijah paused outside a courtroom, observing the procedural flow of cases. The gavel struck, clerks called names, and attorneys argued motions, life continuing under the veneer of institutional stability. Yet beneath the surface, the systemic lesson was clear. Unchecked authority and prejudice were no longer invisible, and even subtle aggression could have lasting consequences. In private, Elijah reflected with his father. The personal cost remains, he said, voice calm, deliberate. Even with accountability, the sting lingers. His father nodded, acknowledging both the endurance required and the ethical victories achieved. Dialogue was sparse, precise, a mutual recognition of the balance between justice served and trauma endured. Elijah considered the broader social implications. The viral video, witness testimony, and formal complaints had catalyzed conversations beyond the immediate incident. Discussions of systemic bias, authority misuse, and institutional reform were ongoing, dialogue among peers, media, and officials evolving. His experience had become both cautionary tale and template for measured resistance against prejudice. Even as professional equilibrium returned, Elijah maintained vigilance. Encounters with authority, procedural reviews, and subtle workplace interactions were now approached with awareness sharpened by experience. Dialogue with colleagues, interns, and friends reinforced lessons. Resilience requires preparation, authority requires accountability, and ethical clarity must guide every action. The courtroom's rhythm, once a backdrop for humiliation, now symbolized the intersection of justice, strategy, and moral principle. Elijah's presence, calm yet resolute, communicated a dual message: personal dignity preserved and systemic accountability enforced. Witnesses who had once hesitated now spoke openly, understanding that courage paired with strategy could expose abuse and provoke change. Harlow's diminished influence, combined with institutional acknowledgement of bias, provided tangible proof that strategic resistance could reshape entrenched power dynamics. Dialogue with administrators reflected not just consequence but awareness, an implicit warning that authority misapplied would no longer remain invisible or unchallenged. The story closed on a cinematic note. Elijah exiting the courthouse, the sunlight casting long, deliberate shadows, a quiet smile touching his lips, not of triumphal satisfaction, but of reflective clarity. The past months had been a crucible, exposing both the fragility of unexamined authority and the resilience required to confront it. He paused at the threshold, inhaling the crisp air, the city alive with movement and possibility. Dialogue in his mind reaffirmed lessons internalized. Justice requires strategy, courage paired with precision, and vigilance against systemic bias. Humiliation had transformed into understanding, confrontation into moral and procedural authority, struggle into enduring insight. The courthouse behind him stood unchanged in structure, yet altered in awareness, a symbol of consequence, accountability, and the subtle reshaping of power. Elijah moved forward, carrying both the weight of experience and the clarity of purpose. The echoes of that day, the slap, the confrontation, and the strategic resistance will persist, not as scars alone, but as enduring markers of resilience, accountability, and the unyielding pursuit of ethical justice.